The last Viking who chose peace. The village by the silent fjord. Nearly 1,000 years ago, on the rugged western coast of Norway, there was a small Viking village hidden between towering mountains and a quiet fjord. It was a place few travelers ever found. There were no great cities nearby, no castles, no crowded markets. Only a handful of wooden longhouses, a weathered dock, and the endless rhythm of the sea. Each morning, the fjord reflected the surrounding mountains like a perfect mirror. Thin wisps of mist floated above the still water, while pine forests climbed the rocky hillsides. Eagles circled high above the cliffs, and the gentle sound of waves echoed softly against the wooden boats resting at the shore. Among the villagers lived an old Viking named Erik. Long ago, Erik had been known as one of the finest sailors in the north. He had crossed the cold waters of the North Sea. He had sailed to Iceland. He had visited distant shores where the summer sun hardly disappeared below the horizon. He had seen towering glaciers, endless forests, and skies filled with thousands of stars. But those adventures now belonged to another lifetime. Today, Erik lived a very different life. His sword rested quietly above the fireplace inside his longhouse. His shield hung beside it, covered with small marks from battles fought many years before. Neither had been touched in nearly 20 winters. Instead of preparing for war, Erik spent his days repairing fishing boats, carving wooden tools, tending a small vegetable garden, and helping his neighbors whenever they needed an extra pair of hands. Many of the younger villagers found this surprising. To them, Vikings were warriors. They imagined great battles, powerful ships, and fearless explorers. Yet Erik rarely spoke about any of those things. If someone asked about his adventures, he simply smiled. "The sea taught me enough stories," he would say quietly. "I don't need to make myself the hero of them." Every morning before sunrise, Erik woke to the gentle sound of seabirds calling across the fjord. His little wooden home smelled of pine timber and the fading embers of last night's fire. He wrapped a thick wool cloak around his shoulders and stepped outside. The cold northern air filled his lungs. He stood silently for several minutes, watching the first golden light slowly appear behind the mountains. There was something deeply peaceful about those moments. The village was still asleep. No voices echoed through the valley. No hammers struck wood. Only the distant cry of gulls and the soft whisper of the wind moving through the pine trees. Erik believed the world always spoke most clearly before everyone else woke up. After a simple breakfast of warm barley porridge, dark rye bread, smoked fish, and a little honey, he carried a wooden bucket toward the dock. Several fishing boats rested quietly beside the shore. Among them floated an old Viking longship. Years earlier, it had carried brave sailors across dangerous seas. Its dragon-headed prow had once faced towering waves and fierce northern storms. Now its days of exploration were over. Erik had carefully transformed it into a peaceful fishing boat. The carved dragon still watched over the fjord, but now it welcomed the sunrise instead of searching for distant battles. Each morning, Erik checked every rope. He tightened loose knots. He replaced worn wooden pegs. He polished the oars with natural oil until the wood shone warmly beneath the morning light. He often said that taking care of a boat was very much like taking care of friendships. Small problems were easiest to fix before they became large ones. Soon other villagers began arriving at the dock. Old fishermen greeted Erik with warm smiles. Young boys carried fishing nets over their shoulders. Women prepared baskets for the day's catch. Everyone knew one another. No one hurried. Life beside the fjord followed the steady rhythm of nature. The seasons decided everything. Spring brought new life. Summer filled the sea with fish. Autumn prepared the village for winter, and winter reminded everyone to appreciate the warmth of home. One afternoon, while Erik was repairing a broken fishing net beneath the shade of a great pine tree, a young boy named Leif approached him. Leif was curious about everything. He loved listening to stories about the old days. "Erik," the boy asked quietly, Is it true that you sailed farther than anyone else in the village? Erik smiled gently. I sailed far. Were you afraid? The old Viking looked toward the calm water. Every sailor feels fear. The brave ones simply learn not to let fear make their decisions. Leif thought about those words carefully. After a long silence, he asked another question. Do you miss those adventures? Erik's eyes rested upon the distant mountains. I miss the friends who shared them, but not the battles. The greatest journey I ever found was learning to enjoy coming home. The boy smiled. He did not fully understand, but one day many years later, he would remember those words. As evening slowly arrived, the village gathered near a large fire overlooking the fjord. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the scent of burning pine wood. Children laughed while chasing one another between the longhouses. Older villagers quietly carved wooden bowls or repaired fishing tools. The sky slowly turned shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. Far above, the first stars began appearing. Erik sat peacefully upon a weathered wooden bench. He watched the calm water reflecting the evening sky. He realized something that many people spend an entire lifetime searching for. True strength is not found in how many battles a person wins. It is found in knowing when peace is the greater victory. The wind grew cooler. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere across the fjord, an owl called into the gathering darkness. One by one, the villagers returned to their homes. Erik remained for a few more moments. He looked toward the quiet sea that had shaped his entire life. It had carried him across distant oceans. It had tested his courage. It had taken dear friends from him. And yet, it had also brought him back home. As the moon rose above the mountains, silver light danced gently across the still water. Erik smiled. Tomorrow would bring another peaceful sunrise, another quiet morning beside the fjord, another simple day filled with kindness, honest work, and gratitude. And for the old Viking who had once searched the world for glory, there was no greater adventure than finally finding peace at home. The last Viking who chose peace. Part 2. The Longship that remembered the sea. The first light of dawn slowly spread across the fjord, painting the still water with soft shades of gold and silver. The mountains stood quietly beneath a pale blue sky, their snow-covered peaks glowing in the early morning light. A thin blanket of mist drifted across the shoreline, moving so gently that it seemed to float without making a sound. The Viking village was still asleep. Only the seabirds had begun their morning songs. Erik stepped outside his longhouse carrying a small wooden lantern. The flame inside had almost burned out, but it had served its purpose through the long northern night. He quietly blew it out and watched a thin ribbon of smoke disappear into the cool morning air. It is a beautiful day, he whispered. As always, his first destination was the old Longship resting beside the wooden dock. The villagers simply called her Sea Swan. She had sailed farther than any other ship in the village. Her weathered oak planks carried the marks of countless voyages. Every scratch told a story. Every repaired board remembered a storm. The carved dragon at her bow had faded with time, but its proud face still looked toward the open sea. Erik gently placed his hand upon the smooth wood. For a long moment, he stood in silence. Some people believed boats were nothing more than timber and nails. Erik believed differently. He thought every ship carried the memories of those who had sailed aboard her. He often spoke to Sea Swan as though she were an old friend. You've earned your rest, he said softly. A gentle breeze crossed the fjord. The ship rocked almost imperceptibly against the dock. It almost felt like an answer. Erik smiled. After checking every rope and fastening every knot, he climbed aboard with a bucket of fresh pine oil. Slowly and carefully, he polished the wooden deck. He repaired tiny cracks before they could become larger. He replaced worn leather bindings on the oars. Good sailors, he believed, respected even the smallest details. Because the sea always noticed carelessness. As the morning grew warmer, several children wandered down to the harbor. Among them was young Leif. He carried a small carved wooden boat in his hands. "I made this," he said proudly. Erik examined the tiny toy carefully. The little boat was simple. Its sail leaned slightly to one side. The carved dragon looked more like a smiling dog than a fierce Viking figurehead. But Erik smiled warmly. "It is wonderful." Leif looked uncertain. "It isn't perfect." Erik handed the little boat back. "Neither is the real one." He pointed towards Sea Swan. "You see those patches?" Leif nodded. They came from storms. "And that mast?" It was replaced after a terrible winter. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Things do not become valuable because they are perfect. They become valuable because they are loved and cared for." The boy quietly looked at his little wooden boat again. This time he smiled. By midday, the fishermen prepared for a short journey into the fjord. The sea was calm. The sky remained clear. Erik joined them not because he needed more fish, but because he enjoyed spending quiet hours upon the water. The Longship glided gently across the mirror-like fjord. The oars entered the water without a splash. Above them, white clouds drifted lazily across the endless northern sky. No one hurried, no one raised their voice. The only sounds were the soft rhythm of the oars and the distant cries of seabirds. Leif sat beside Erik. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, the boy asked, "Did the sea ever frighten you?" Erik nodded slowly. "Many times. Even after all your journeys?" "Especially after them." The boy looked surprised. "I thought brave people stopped being afraid." Erik smiled. "No. Brave people simply learn to respect what is powerful." He dipped his hand gently into the cold water. "The sea deserves respect. So do mountains. So do storms. And so do people." The little boat drifted peacefully between towering cliffs. Waterfalls poured gently from high rocks into the fjord below. Seals rested upon smooth stones, watching the fishermen with quiet curiosity. Everything felt calm. Everything moved at the slow, peaceful rhythm of nature. Later that afternoon, the fishermen returned with baskets of fresh cod and herring. The village welcomed them with warm smiles. Children helped carry the catch. Women prepared the fish for smoking and drying. Nothing was wasted. Every gift from the sea was treated with gratitude. As evening approached, Erik returned alone to the dock. The village had grown quiet once again. Golden sunlight stretched across the calm water. Sea Swan rested peacefully where she had rested every evening for many years. Erik sat at the end of the wooden pier. His feet hung gently above the water. He watched the sunlight slowly fade from the mountains. There had once been a time when he dreamed only of distant horizons. He believed happiness always waited somewhere beyond the next voyage, beyond the next island, beyond the next adventure. Now he understood something different. Sometimes the greatest journey was learning to appreciate the place where you already belonged. The first evening stay in appeared above the fjord. Soon another joined it, then another. Their reflections shimmered softly across the still water. Erik closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The waves whispered against the dock. The pine trees sighed gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl greeted the coming night. It was the same peaceful song the fjord had sung for hundreds of years. And as darkness slowly settled over the quiet Viking village, Erik realized he no longer measured his life by the number of miles he had sailed. Instead, he measured it by peaceful evenings like this one. Evenings filled with gratitude, with friendship, with gentle silence, and with the comforting knowledge that tomorrow, when the first light returned to the fjord, another beautiful day would quietly begin. The last Viking who chose peace to part 3, the forest of quiet pines. The sun rose gently over the Norwegian fjord, casting long rays of golden light across the still water. The village slowly awakened as thin streams of smoke curled from the chimneys of the wooden longhouses. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine, moss, and the salty sea. Erik stood outside his home with a woven basket resting over one shoulder. Today he was not going to the sea. Instead, he would spend the day in the great pine forest that covered the mountains behind the village. The villagers often called it the Forest of Quiet Pines. It was a place where the wind seemed to whisper rather than blow. Ancient trees stretched high into the sky, their branches gently swaying above carpets of soft green moss. Small streams flowed between smooth stones, and wildflowers bloomed wherever sunlight reached the forest floor. Erik had walked these woodland paths since he was a young boy. Every tree felt like an old friend. Every bend in the trail held a memory. As he entered the forest, the sounds of the village slowly disappeared. Only birdsong remained. Tiny robins hopped from branch to branch. Woodpeckers tapped softly against old tree trunks. Far away, a waterfall murmured like a peaceful lullaby. Erik breathed deeply. The forest has its own voice, he whispered, and it always speaks gently. He walked slowly, never rushing. He admired the dew resting on fern leaves. He stopped to watch a family of red squirrels gathering pine cones. He noticed tiny mushrooms growing beside fallen logs. Many travelers hurried through forests without truly seeing them. Erik believed every quiet place deserved to be noticed. After nearly an hour, he reached a small clearing where sunlight poured through the tall trees. In the center stood a great pine tree, far older than any other in the valley. Its enormous trunk could not be embraced by a single person. Its branches stretched proudly toward the sky. When Erik was a child, his grandfather had brought him here. This tree, his grandfather had said, has stood through more winters than anyone alive. It teaches us that strength comes from standing patiently, not from moving quickly. Erik smiled as he remembered those words. He gently placed his hand against the rough bark. The tree felt cool beneath his fingers. It had watched generations come and go. Children had become parents. Parents had become grandparents. Yet the old pine remained, steady, patient, quiet. Just beyond the clearing, Erik found the small stream where he often collected fresh water. The water was crystal clear, flowing gently over smooth stones polished by hundreds of years. He knelt beside it and filled his wooden flask. Nearby, several deer drank peacefully without fear. They had grown familiar with the gentle old Viking who never disturbed them. One young fawn lifted its head and looked curiously toward Erik. He smiled but remained perfectly still. After a few moments, the little animal returned to drinking. Trust, Erik believed, was never forced. It was earned slowly through kindness. By midday, warm sunlight filtered through the branches. Erik found a fallen log beside the stream and unpacked his simple lunch. Fresh rye bread, a piece of smoked salmon, goat cheese, wild berries gathered earlier that morning. As he ate, he listened to the peaceful sounds around him. There was no hurry, no noise, only nature following its timeless rhythm. After lunch, Erik carved a small wooden bird from a piece of pine. His knife moved slowly and carefully. Each gentle cut revealed another little detail. By late afternoon, the bird was finished. Its wings were simple, its shape was not perfect, but it carried the warmth of patient hands. As Erik prepared to return home, he noticed young Leif walking carefully along the forest path. The boy looked surprised. "I hoped I'd find you here," Leif said. Erik laughed softly. "The forest usually knows where to find me." Leif sat beside him on the fallen log. For a while, they simply listened. Finally, the boy asked, "Why do you come here so often?" Erik looked toward the towering pine trees. "When I was young, I believed silence meant emptiness. But now I know silence is full of beautiful things." Leif listened carefully. The trees teach patience. The birds teach joy. The stream teaches us to keep moving forward. And the mountains remind us that some things grow strong very slowly. The boy looked around the forest with new eyes. For the first time, he noticed how peaceful everything truly was. The two of them walked back toward the village together as the afternoon sunlight turned warm and golden. The fjords sparkled below the mountains. Smoke drifted gently from the rooftops. Children laughed near the shoreline. Fishing boats rocked softly beside the dock. It was another ordinary evening. Yet Erik knew that ordinary days often became the most precious memories. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, he paused one last time and looked back toward the quiet forest. The old pine trees stood silently beneath the evening sky. They asked for nothing. They expected nothing. Yet every day they offered shade, shelter, and beauty to anyone willing to slow down long enough to notice. Erik smiled. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another peaceful walk, another quiet lesson from the land he loved. And in the gentle silence of the northern forest, he found something more valuable than treasure. He found peace. Part 5. The Winter Fire and the Old Stories. Winter arrived quietly in the northern fjord. The first snowfall came during the night, covering the mountains, the forests, and the roofs of the village with a blanket of soft white snow. When the morning sun finally rose, the entire valley seemed to glow. The frozen fjord reflected the pale winter sky, while tiny snowflakes sparkled like thousands of little stars. Erik stepped outside his longhouse and smiled. He loved winter. Many people feared the long northern nights, but Erik had learned many years ago that winter was not a season to fight. It was a season to slow down. He wrapped his thick wool cloak tightly around his shoulders and walked through the quiet village. Fresh snow crunched softly beneath his leather boots. Smoke rose gently from every chimney. The smell of burning pine wood drifted through the cold morning air. Children laughed as they built small snow figures beside their homes. The village felt peaceful. Everything moved a little slower, and that was exactly how winter was meant to be. After helping a neighbor gather firewood, Erik returned to his own home. He carefully stacked the logs beside the stone fireplace. Then he lit a small fire. The flames danced gently, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning oak. Above the fireplace still hung his old Viking sword and shield. They had not moved in many years. Sometimes visitors asked why he kept them. Erik always gave the same quiet answer. They remind me how far I have traveled, but they also remind me why I chose peace. As afternoon faded into evening, the villagers gathered inside the largest longhouse. This had become a winter tradition passed down through generations. The long nights were not filled with battles or loud celebrations. Instead, families gathered around the fire. Some repaired fishing nets, others carved wooden bowls or knitted warm wool clothing. Children listened carefully as the elders shared stories from long ago. That evening, Erik was invited to tell one of his own. The children gathered close. Even the adults smiled quietly, eager to hear the gentle old sailor speak. Erik looked into the glowing fire before beginning. "When I was young," he said softly, "I believed the greatest treasure was gold. I thought the greatest victory was winning battles. And I believed the greatest adventure was sailing farther than anyone else." The room became completely silent. The only sound was the crackling fire. Erik smiled. But the sea taught me something very different. It taught me that every storm eventually ends. It taught me that every traveler dreams of coming home. And it taught me that kindness is remembered much longer than strength. The children listened with wide eyes. Little Leif sat quietly in the front. He never looked away. Erik reached into a small wooden chest beside his chair. Inside rested a smooth stone. It was dark gray with a single white line running across it. "I found this many years ago," he said, "on a lonely island far across the sea." A little girl asked, "Is it valuable?" Erik smiled warmly. "Only because it reminds me of someone." He explained that during one terrible storm, another sailor had shared his last piece of bread with him. They had survived together. Years later, that sailor gave Erik the small stone as a reminder. Real treasure, Erik said gently, is not something you keep in a chest. It is something you carry in your heart. The children nodded thoughtfully. Outside, snow continued to fall. The wind whispered softly against the wooden walls of the longhouse. Inside, the fire burned warmly. For a while, no one spoke. Everyone simply watched the flames dance. Erik loved moments like these. They reminded him that happiness was often found in the quietest places, not in distant kingdoms, not aboard great ships, but beside people who cared for one another. Later that night, after everyone had returned home, Erik stepped outside once more. Fresh snow covered the village. The moon shone brightly above the mountains. The stars seemed closer than ever. Everything was peaceful. He walked slowly toward the frozen edge of the fjord. The ice reflected the moonlight like polished silver. Far away, an owl called softly through the winter forest. Erik stood there for several minutes. He remembered the countless winters he had seen. Some had been harsh, others had been gentle, but each one had taught him patience. Each one had reminded him that spring always returned. As he looked across the quiet landscape, he smiled. The village was safe. The children were warm. The fishing boats rested peacefully beneath the snow. Tomorrow would be another quiet winter day. There would be firewood to gather, boats to repair, stories to tell, and perhaps another lesson to share with the next generation. The northern wind drifted gently across the frozen fjord. The fire still glowed warmly inside Erik's longhouse. And beneath the endless stars of the Viking sky, the old sailor realized that the greatest stories were never about kings or battles. They were about ordinary days, shared with kind people, in a place that truly felt like home. As the snow continued falling silently over the peaceful village, Erik whispered a quiet thank you to the sea, the mountains, and the long road that had led him home. Then he stepped inside, closed the wooden door, and let the warmth of the fire welcome him into another calm northern night. Good night. Part 6, The Spring of New Beginnings. The long northern winter slowly came to an end. Day by day, the snow covering the mountains began to melt. Small streams carried fresh water down into the valley, and the frozen fjord gradually returned to life. Tiny patches of green grass appeared beneath the melting snow, and the first wildflowers bravely welcomed the spring sunshine. The village felt different. The air smelled fresh. Bird song returned to the forests. Fishing boats gently floated once again upon the calm blue water. Erik stood beside the wooden dock as the morning sun painted the fjord with soft golden light. He smiled quietly. Spring had always been his favorite season. It reminded him that every ending quietly prepares the way for a new beginning. The old Viking picked up a wooden bucket and began washing the deck of Sea Swan. The Longship had rested peacefully through the winter. Now she was ready to sail once again. Not to distant kingdoms, not in search of treasure, only to carry friends across the peaceful waters of the fjord. As Erik worked, he heard familiar footsteps behind him. It was Leif. The young boy had grown taller over the winter. He now carried his own fishing net over one shoulder. Good morning, Erik. Good morning, Leif. I was hoping you might teach me how to prepare the boat. Erik smiled. I was hoping you would ask. Together they inspected every part of the Longship. Erik showed him how to examine the wooden planks for cracks. He explained why every rope had to be checked before leaving the shore. He carefully demonstrated how to oil the oars so they would glide smoothly through the water. The sea rewards those who prepare well, Erik said, and it teaches difficult lessons to those who do not. Leif listened carefully. He wanted to remember every word. By late morning, the little boat was ready. The two of them pushed Sea Swan gently into the clear water. The fjord was perfectly calm. Snow still rested upon the highest mountain peaks, while the valleys below had become bright green once again. As they rowed slowly away from the village, The only sounds were the gentle splash of the oars and the distant calls of seabirds circling overhead. Neither of them hurried. The sea had no need for haste. After a while, Leif asked, "Erik, after all your journeys, do you still dream of sailing to faraway lands?" The old Viking looked toward the distant horizon. "There was a time when I did, but not anymore." Erik rested his hand upon the side of the boat. "Because I discovered that peace is a place you carry inside yourself. You can sail across every ocean in the world, but if your heart never becomes calm, you will always feel far from home." Leif remained silent. The words settled gently into his heart like falling leaves. Around midday, they reached a small island covered with pine trees and wildflowers. They pulled the boat onto the shore and shared a simple meal. Fresh bread, goat cheese, smoked salmon, wild berries gathered that morning. As they ate, seals rested upon nearby rocks, warming themselves beneath the gentle spring sunshine. An eagle soared high above the cliffs. The world felt wonderfully quiet. After lunch, Erik carved another small wooden bird. This one he handed to Leif. "So you remember today?" The boy smiled. "I'll keep it forever." Erik laughed softly. "Perhaps one day, you'll give it to someone else." The afternoon passed peacefully. On their journey home, they rowed slowly through waters so clear that they could see fish swimming beneath the boat. The mountains reflected perfectly upon the still surface of the fjord. It seemed impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. As the village appeared once again in the distance, Erik felt deeply thankful. His greatest adventures were no longer measured by the miles he had traveled. Instead, they were measured by quiet conversations, simple kindness, shared meals, and peaceful days like this one. When they reached the dock, several children ran forward to help tie the boat. The villagers smiled warmly as Erik and Leif returned. Nothing extraordinary had happened that day. No storms, no battles, no great discoveries. And yet, it had been one of the happiest days Erik could remember. That evening, the entire village gathered beside the fjord to celebrate the arrival of spring. A small fire burned near the shoreline. Musicians played gentle melodies on wooden flutes and simple harps. Children laughed as they danced across the grass. Families shared bread, smoked fish, fresh milk, and honey. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains, the sky turned brilliant shades of gold, pink, and violet. Erik sat quietly near the water's edge. Leif joined him. Together, they watched the last light of day fade into the peaceful northern sky. Finally, Leif asked one last question. "What do you hope people will remember about you?" Erik smiled. He thought for a long moment before answering.